Welcome to Improving Intimacy, a podcast to help single and married Latter-day Saints strengthen their family connections and marriages. Daniel A. Burgess is the host of Improving Intimacy. Daniel's a marriage and family therapist, father, husband, and author. Here's Daniel on this episode of Improving Intimacy. All right, men, welcome to today's episode. I've got a special guest for us today. This is Daniel Burgess. So he is a family therapist. He runs Ascent Family Therapy and helps couples and individuals with their marriages. And I met him in his Facebook group, Improving Intimacy, used to be called Mormon Marriages. Now it's called in Latter-day Saint Marriages.
I complied.
So yeah, anything else you want the audience to know about you, Daniel?
That's great. I love that. Yeah, come check it out.
Yeah, he does great work. I've really enjoyed, his.
Thank you.
Yeah, his group and the stuff he's doing. So today we're talking about a more sensitive topic, at least in the LDS community, which is masturbation. And Daniel's done a lot of study about this, a lot of work on it. It was coming into your group, actually, Daniel, that kind of got me thinking about it in a different way and was really a good journey for me, actually. So I appreciate your work on that. So I guess what I wanted to start with, and I think this is really the big question on most LDS people's minds, is whether masturbation is actually a sin or not. And when I asked that question, I wanted to look up what sin actually was. And so, I think this is a good definition: an immoral act that's considered to be a transgression against divine law. Meaning there's a law that says no masturbation, and then when you break that, you are breaking that law. Yeah. So yeah.
That's a great question. It's one that I get quite frequently, and to kind of set up the answer here, I just did an interview for my podcast, Improving Intimacy for Latter-day Saint Relationships, with Carrie Ferguson, who wrote the book, The OCD Mormon. And the reason why I bring that up is a big part of our discussion, something that I've seen definitely in clients who tend to ask this question, is rigidity in their thinking around spirituality and sin, and how that negatively affects, ironically, maybe even paradoxically, our spirituality. A fabulous book, a wonderful person, and we explored those thoughts in deep, and I'll reference you to that for further discussion. But in short, I love that definition that I learned, at least on my mission, was anything acting against the will of God is sin. And sin is essentially a guide for us to draw closer to him, not to sin to draw closer to him, but to avoid sin or things that separate us from God. And when we can think about it in that context, we can now see self-mastery in a different view. We even talk about transgression. Joseph Fielding Smith says there's a big difference between transgression and sin. Transgression are the things that we as humans learn to be better at, that Heavenly Father expects us to make mistakes. That's why the atonement is there. Now, to answer that question, is masturbation a sin? I don't want to sound avoidant of the answer, but it really depends. It really depends on the person. Is this drawing you closer to God? Is this helping you understand your body? Is this creating better self-awareness, self-mastery? Is it creating peace in your life? If it isn't, then that needs to be explored and understood better. Right? That's the whole purpose of this life, is to master our minds and our bodies. And what does that look like? Especially when we're dealing with different biology. And sometimes people say you should never masturbate. Well, that may be true for that person. That may not be a biological need, or when I use the word need here, I'm talking about experiences that provide enjoyment and pleasure. Of course, we could go a whole lifetime without masturbating and not die, right? And I've heard people use that argument: you won't die, so you don't need it. Well, then we could go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We won't die without people loving us in our life, but our life will be pretty miserable, right? And there are cases actually that children have died out of neglect of love, and that's true. But I think the point is there is, I think when we look at this in a very rigid way, is it a sin or black and white? We kind of cross into this line of kind of obsessive compulsive thought process or
Yeah.
scrupulosity, and focus more on the rule than our relationship with ourself and the Lord.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea of those questions that you posed, of instead of is this a sin, which, like you said, is about, oh, right, wrong, did I follow the rule right, or did I not follow the rule right? It's like, no, is this bringing me closer to God? Is this helping me enjoy my life more? I think once you're married, an important question with however you're using your sexuality is this bringing me closer to my spouse or not? And I think with that too, you mentioned, I think for women this happens maybe sometimes more than guys, where that exploration process maybe hasn't happened as much as it has maybe with some guys before marriage. And actually exploring that and figuring out what works for you, can be a gift to yourself and to your marriage. But thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the main goal. And that's why I set up my group, Improving Intimacy in Latter-day Saint Relationships, is for us, what are we doing in our relationships, our intimate relationships, that we can improve on to draw us closer to God? That is the underlining and the core focus here. How can we understand and learn God and draw closer to Him, and in our relationships? And so that could involve, often we sacrifice, or we ignore, or we neglect our sexual self and don't really explore and understand that like we do the other aspects of our spiritual life to draw closer to God. And so this is very much a negotiation, a discussion with our partner and with the Lord. And as long as it's in that confine, I believe it's healthy. Whatever that decision is, I have seen masturbation benefit and reward relationships like no other thing has in their life. It provides options, it provides a discussion. And I think as long as you're taking it to the Lord and you're addressing it with your spouse, and you come up with what works for you, then you're doing what the Lord wants you to do, drawing closer to Him and your spouse.
Yeah, awesome. So with that, kind of to look at the other side of this, right? Because I think some people hearing that, they're going to think, oh, well, then, then I can do whatever I want.
Yeah.
Like if I want to go have sex with a bunch of other people, and like we're both okay with that, then that should be fine, right?
Yeah.
So what would you say to that thought? Oh,
Well,
I prayed about it, and like that was my answer. It was fine to go do that.
yeah, it's interesting because that I heard kind of two different questions or comments. There's one, kind of this non-monogamous exploration. As long as you agree with it, it's fine. And the other one is anything. Well, I guess that kind of the same thing. Anything goes now. And the first thought I would have or question is, this seems to fall under this black and white thinking. Is either it's absolutely right or it's absolutely wrong. And I think the Lord has definitely, at least in our day, made some clear guidelines in the temple. We specifically commit to each other in this relationship. Now, does that mean anything goes or not? I think there's definitely a constraint there. We've committed very specifically to each other that we will figure this out between each other and the Lord. I don't think there's a carte blanche there that says, yeah, anything outside your relationship is okay. The purpose, like I was pointing out, is it drawing you closer to your spouse and to the Lord? Do you feel like you're honoring your temple covenants that you specifically made? Now, when we talk about masturbation and things that help improve desire towards each other, I think those things are open for discussion and prayer with Heavenly Father. Now, going back to your question, some can argue, well, we both decided we feel closer to each other when we could explore outside of the relationship. And I'll be frank, if that's what you have decided, I personally don't think that's what the Lord has said, and I don't see any justification for that. And so I'm not going to tell somebody that they got false revelation. That's not my job as a therapist. My job is to help them understand how to live a healthier life.
Right.
And so there's an argument for everything, and I could totally see where people can, and I've seen it, well, I'm going to go and do whatever. And when I hear that phrase, though, that triggers this kind of black and white thinking, going from one extreme of rigidity to another.
Yeah.
And I would push on that. I would really explore that. Is that really what you're doing? Are you going from what I'm going to just say kind of like a repressed or rigid thinking to, wow, the doors just blew open, I'm going to do whatever I want? That would be a concern to me, and I would explore that first. That's a concern to me.
Yeah, I think you brought up something super important. I think they're both basically immature reactions.
Oh, excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, oh, either somebody has to tell me everything I have to do, or nobody can tell me anything that I have to do, right? Like, they're both pretty immature, versus saying like, look, okay, here's my read of the scriptures, or if that's what I believe. We're kind of assuming someone's sort of like active LDS or Christian, like trying to do what God wants them to do, and if you come into it with that in mind, and you're like, hey, like, I read the scripture, I did, if you went to the temple, like, I made these promises, I'm going to be just be faithful to my wife, so like I want to keep it within that, but then within that, like you said, like growing, developing that maturity to say, yeah, this does help and this does not help. One of the things that I like is by their fruits ye shall know them, and I think that so applies here. If you try it and the fruit is good. If you try it and the food is not good, you say, okay, like, that was an experiment, wasn't good, we're gonna cut that one off. So
yeah, great points.
Yeah. So for the like, maybe to satisfy some of the more OCD Mormon folks out there, I know you've done quite a bit of research on how sort of the church has looked at masturbation over time, and kind of how that has shifted sort of back and forth. Maybe you could just give us sort of a brief kind of summary of how that's gone.
Yeah, really, really quick summary here. There's very little documentation from the Restoration, from like 1830 to about 1890. We're getting more and more as the Joseph Smith papers are in development, and it's exciting. Public access, a lot of people go to it. When I was researching it, I had to spend hours and hours in archives and trying to find these documentation. There really isn't much. In fact, we had a very if I could use the word progressive view of intimacy. We were a very different church. We viewed sexual relationships as beautiful. And in a time that orgasms were viewed as dangerous and lethal. They literally believed that each time you had an orgasm, you took years off your life. This was that idea back then. That really didn't end until about 1920s, maybe a little earlier than that. And we had a very opposing view to that, not in a very positive way. And we only start to see, even if I could say it's negative comments about masturbation, only in the context of serious transgressions where people are having, I want to be appropriate for the show, let's just say sexual abuse issues. Let's just keep it in those terms. And there was ideas that were prominent at that time, not just in the church, but because we're a melting pot of religions at the Restoration. We had a lot of traditional cultural ideas being brought in, thinking that masturbation led to certain behaviors, including homosexuality and to other sexual transgressions. And so the only things you can really find that I'm aware of now, and I've researched this extensively, as you mentioned, is in meeting notes where some brethren will say it's because they did this, and they would reference masturbation, and this is where it would lead. There was never any official stance against masturbation. In fact, it was about 1920 that there was a conference address of some guest who says, we approach sexuality, and I could provide these links and references to you offline, and you could include,
Yeah.
but saying, I'm impressed that you Latter-day Saints can talk about sexuality, including masturbation, so openly, which blew my mind. I was like, really? I mean, not only to recognize that, but to even make it part of a public address. And then in 1930, the Relief Society president at the time was called to provide mental health guidance to the church. And she provided, Amy Lyman Brown, it provided these lessons. And one of those lessons was, parents, don't overreact to your children masturbating. You'll cause depression, anxiety, even suicidal thoughts. Very fascinating. It wasn't until about the 40s that President Clark started to interject other ideas. And long story short, my interpretation of that was because of the Kinsey books came out on human sexuality and the father of the sexual revolution. And I think the church was trying to do something to differentiate ourselves from that movement, which I both understand, but also see kind of a shift in the opposite direction. And it's only at that time that we see really negative comments and emphasis on the dangers of masturbation and emphasizing it as a sin. And then we see this changing in the mid 80s due to seeing, Amy Lyman Brown was right. We're seeing an increase of depression, suicidal thoughts, and negative behavior, unhealthy behavior. And so since the 80s, we've been seeing a more healthy shift towards, this doesn't cause homosexuality. It doesn't cause all these things that we believe they did. And it is part of a healthy development. And so they haven't specifically come out and reversed some of those comments for strength of youth manuals and whatnot, but we definitely see a shift of them eliminating those phrases and terminologies out of the manuals and handbooks, and seeing a more positive shift towards, figure this out between you and the Lord, especially in marriage. So that's a really, really horrible summary, but a quick summary.
I thought it was great.
Okay, good.
I thought that was a great summary. Well, yeah, I think the way that after I read through your materials, the way I looked at it was like, it's okay, or it's, even like part of normal development.
Wasn't even addressed, yeah.
Yeah, to bad. And now we're kind of coming back up to like, I think like you said, like President Nelson's really focusing on personal revelation and like using this, like this can be a place where you really can use personal revelation and you really can, look at what are the fruits of, exploring that, of, looking at how sexuality is part of who you are.
Yeah, and let me add real quick. One thing, when we analyze developments in the church, whether doctrinal, history, or whatever, we make a mistake of seeing things in isolation. And we got to realize there was a lot going on during that period of the 40s. We had one of the fastest booming growths of the church to this date, from like the 40s to the 70s. And so the brethren were also trying to address, how do we address a growing church? And they created the Department of Correlation and everything else. And so they try to standardize teachings across an entire world of membership. And so there's bound to be learning, lessons learned in things not perfectly instituted. And so I think it's important for us to kind of take ourselves out of the vacuum and realize thousands of variables are involved here. It's not just, is something, we go back to that rigidity, is something right or wrong? And I think what we're doing is now we're learning, how do we teach a worldwide church, not just a Salt Lake church anymore?
Yeah. Oh, awesome. And super helpful. I think like you mentioned, it's not so much, we're trying to grow out of the, even like, home teaching, like, oh, once a month, go. And now it's like minister, meaning take care of these people and use like your judgment and your, like what these people need, example, and addressing that. And I think with sexuality, we're starting to see some of that as well. It just, there are structures, like there are lines. I think, being sexually faithful to your wife is a pretty clear line. or husband, right? As far as like an actual commandment or like an actual law that God's given us. But then outside of that, saying, okay, like how do I, like sexuality is part of who I am. Um, it's weird, but Jennifer Finlayson Five talks about this, how like God is a sexual being and like Heavenly Mother's a sexual being. It's weird for us to think about, but like we're created in their image, like they have that too. And like how did they use that? One of the things that you work with people who struggle with pornography too, um, and or want to use less or whatever. Yeah, one of the things that I've encouraged people to ask themselves is like, okay, I have my sexuality, like how do I want to use that in
Yes.
the world? Um, and then that becomes the standard, right? Instead of, oh, can I do this or can I do that? It's like, no, like, so for me, my own like statement is, yeah, I want to use my sexuality to connect deeply with and have fun with my wife. And so now I look and say, okay, is this helping me get there or is it detracting from that? And that's been much more
Mm-hmm.
useful than going down this, OCD
Yes.
OCD
And
track.
especially for the men, and I want to emphasize this for us men. One of the negative consequences of how we've treated sexuality over the years, and I'm not just speaking church culture, but it definitely was reinforced by church culture, is men talking about sexuality is synonymous with creepiness and weird and dangerous. And we've unfortunately associated words like lust as a negative thing. And I realize like Matthew 5:27 uses the word lust. And this is a perfect example of how we've had a false narrative created for us. And this is what I mean. Matthew 5:27 is actually a misinterpretation. The word actually should be coveted, not lust. Lust is actually that specific word translated correctly is used as a positive throughout scripture. In Luke 22:15, Matthew 13:17, Luke 15:16, and Luke 16:21, all described Christ himself lusting after something, whether it's the Passover or righteousness or whatever. And I realize it's a little nuanced, but I think it's an important nuance because I often hear I've got to avoid lust. And why is this important? Because he emphasized it is scripturally based. Lust means to desire beauty, to desire something good, godlike. Covet is negative. It's not Christ focused. It's not God focused, which has resulted us men specifically. Let me emphasize why I'm bringing this up too, because this is a conversation I frequently have with colleagues and clients is if you may be wondering, and I realize I'm blending a little bit of topics here, but bear with me, is you may be wondering, well, am I rigid in my thinking? No, I just want to be perfect. Well, that's one indicator that you might actually have rigid scrupulosity thinking. And the other is that, my mind just went blank, sorry, that you can't, oh, that's what it was. You can't pray to God about your desires. And I see this more with men than with women. And this is a constant paradox. It's like women who speak up about sexuality are praised for their courageousness. Men who talk up about their sexuality or I pray to God about this will be perceived as creepy or weird. Or we may feel creepy or weird. I can't talk to God about my sexuality. That may be an indicator that you have rigid thinking around this. If our heavenly parents desire us to have sexual feelings and desires, we should be able to freely talk to them about it. And if we can't, that's the negative narrative I believe that we've been taught as men. And if we want sexual relationships, we're looked at as pawing or begging or sex focus or lusting after. No, it's beautiful. We desire to have sexual relations with our spouse, and we need to speak up and break that narrative and rewrite how we talk about that and how that talk is being perceived. I think that's why a lot of men default to the joking or the silliness or whatever, because that's what they've been told to do and who they are. And we need to take back that narrative and like the women can, I'm gonna I want to talk about sexuality and be praised for it. It's a beautiful, healthy thing. I desire to be a sexual being, and that's not weird.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we men should remember.
Yeah. Great point. Great point. Yeah, I think when we look at owning that and directing that, it's a powerful force, powerful energy, and deciding how I want to direct it. I love what you said about taking it to God, saying, look, I have these desires, like what's the way to direct them? And Alma talks about bridling our passions. It doesn't mean that you stop your passions or like kill your passions. It's no, you bridle them, you direct them, to where you want to go.
And one last thought on this whole idea of what it looks like to desire. One of the things that I find is beautiful in my relationship with my wife, and I think is appropriate, is we are able to say, that person looks beautiful, male or female. She's attractive, he's attractive. And our relationship is not threatened. Our trust in our relationship is solid. It isn't dependent on whether or not we speak up our desires or not. And that's a false narrative. That's another false narrative is now in context, right? If, for example, trauma history, we've got to respect and understand that context. We can't just say, tough, I don't care about your trauma, or I don't care about your insecurities. I've worked with a client in the past where the wife acknowledged she has huge amounts of insecurities. And because her husband, she found her husband was looking at an Instagram model, not even pornography in its truest sense. And he acknowledged it. He's never had a history of anything. She's required him to purge himself of any of that desire versus her looking at her self and building on her issues around insecurity. It's a team effort. You both need a partner in this experience, as I think you know and understand. But when it becomes a one-sided thing, blaming a partner, and there's clearly breaking the line, right? It's interesting though, when a woman says they desire or they think something is beautiful, it could be totally fine and not a threat to a relationship. But if a man says that, this is that false narrative, it's impossible for a man to see something that's beautiful, acknowledge it, and still have a fully committed, cleaving unto their partner relationship. And we're told often that that's not possible. We're not as simple creatures on and off switches as I think we've been taught. We also desire connection and monogamy. We just also are trying to understand how to express and experience desire.
Yeah, no, I like that idea a lot. And I think, there's, when you do get to a level of sexual intimacy that is really connected, where you are sharing who you are at a deep level with this person and they're sharing with you. And, that's just something that when we talk about like save yourself for marriage, we teach our kids, hey, it's like save yourself for marriage. Why do you do that? Because ideally, like when you have sex with your wife, you are sharing your whole soul with that person. Like, this is who you want to be with, this is who you want to raise a family with, this is who you want to spend your life with. And that all comes through this physical act, and that's why you save it. It's not because it's like wrong and then all of a sudden it's right. It's like, no, this is something so powerful and good and connecting that you want to choose someone really special to do that with. So then to put that in context, so you say, oh yeah, that girl is hot or whatever, doesn't mean I want to connect with this person physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and spend my life with them. Like,
no,
when you have sex with them, when
that's
you do
that black and white thinking.
Right. Yeah. So, I think when you do experience that connection, it's just so rich and powerful that, it's something that you want to, enjoy.
I was just telling my wife this morning, I actually thanked her. I says, I'm so thankful. And this is sparking from a thread that I was following, and how people were arguing that they can't even look. They can't have any other desires except for unto their wife. And well, at its core, I believe that. The only desire I have is for my wife. I turned to her as I was waking up. I says, I'm really thankful that you can tell me you find certain things attractive. That's beautiful to me. That tells me that you have desire, that you have an appreciation for these things. And in no way do I ever feel threatened. It's never a feeling of like, oh, you want me to look like that. That's my insecurity if I ever feel that way.
Sure.
And I would actually be concerned if she never said that, if she never pointed out, wow, she has a good butt. Oh, he has good abs. I would wonder, is your blood cold? Do you not do you not see these things? Do you not appreciate it? It's like looking at art. Can't we look at other things, art or things that are beautiful? And are we afraid that our partner is going to become more attracted to that thing? I'm not trying to be silly, but in all seriousness, I mean, we should have interests and desires. That doesn't mean we're going to make a commitment or break a relationship because of it. I think it's very objectifying. I think it's ironically objectifying to say that men can't have more complex experiences and a commitment solely to their partner while also appreciating something that looks beautiful.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed myself doing too is if I find my thoughts, so yeah, you can appreciate, oh yeah, that's a good looking girl, she's pretty. But if I notice that I'm starting to run down that track of like, attraction or wanting to like have sex with this person, like what I found more useful for myself, instead of like trying to just shut that all down, be like, no, don't think that. I actually go the other way. I'm like, okay, let's say that it goes that way. Like, is that really what I want? Like, do I want to destroy my family? Do I want
Excellent.
to like be that example to my kids? Do I want to do all that? Then all of a sudden it's like, no. Like, is that worth a few seconds of pleasure? Or
yeah.
Definitely not. And that for me, that's been a lot more helpful than trying to be like, oh, this is bad, don't think that way.
Yeah, that's what we call acceptance commitment therapy. Good for you. And I think you hit it on the head right there. Is if you start to think you want to have sex with this thing or this person you think is beautiful, address that thought.
Right.
I think that's a narrative that we've been taught. That's as soon as we find a woman or a person attractive, we now sexually crave that person. We need to break that narrative. That doesn't have to be the triggering thought. And I everybody's different, of course, but I think we've been trained to think that way. And I think by addressing that concerning behavior or that concerning thought, and addressing that, or like you did, you experience it, you say, do you really want to do that? That's what's important, not shutting down all desire.
Yeah. Very good. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Let's do a quick summary here. So, we talked about the idea of, is masturbation a sin or not? And I think you really
take it to the Lord.
Yeah, I think you really put it well, which is, that's actually the wrong question. The question is, is the way I'm using my sexuality, whether that includes masturbation or whatever, is that bringing me closer to God? Is it bringing me closer to my wife or not? Right. And then asking yourself too, is it in line with, what has clearly been revealed? If that's an integrity to you, to be someone that's following basically what God says. He's been pretty clear as far as being monogamous once you're married, but outside of that, there's not like a cut and dry, like this is how sex is supposed to be in marriage. So from there, it's more about, like you said, is this drawing me closer to my wife? Is this drawing me closer to God? And then, I think that's basically the summary.
Excellent. No, I think it's a good summary. It's a pleasure is always, Mike.
Likewise. Yeah, very good.
If anybody has, I realize it's pretty quick. If anybody has any questions or want clarification, I know we did a lot in a very short amount of time. My email is always open. In my contact, you'll include that information, and feel free to reach out.
Yeah, great. Yeah, maybe if you just want to call out one more time the easiest way to find you.
You know what? Yeah, I run the Scent Family Therapy, but the best way is to go to my personal website, where I have this all specifically for Latter-day Saints, is my full name, DanielABurgess.com. And you'll find everything with the Improving Intimacy there, and all the articles that you referenced and my blogs and my podcast there and my contact info. So DanielAburgess.com.
Perfect. Hey, thanks so much, Daniel. Appreciate your time today. And all right, stay strong, men. We will see you next episode.
Thank you.